The wind screamed across the Colorado plains like a choir of ghosts, bending the young cottonwoods until their branches snapped against the darkness. Rain came in sheets, needling the earth, drumming against rooftops, and drowning the sound of everything except thunder. To most folks in Cedar Ridge, it was just another spring storm rolling down from the Rockies, loud, merciless, and gone by dawn. But to Caleb Turner, this storm carried something else, a weight that pressed against his chest like an old debt come due. He stood on the porch of his farmhouse, shoulders hunched against the wet, watching his fields blur into shadows. The corn he had planted by hand a week ago lay hidden beneath waterlogged rows, small lives swallowed by mud. His hat brim dripped steady rivulets down his collar, but he didn't move. He had stood through storms before. He knew how to wait them out. Yet tonight wasn't the same. Behind him, in the far corner of his property, loomed the old barn, its roof sagging, boards warped, paint long peeled away by wind and time. Caleb hadn't set foot in it for 15 years, not since the day he buried his boy. To anyone else, it was just a rotting structure. To Caleb, it was a tomb with wooden walls, sealed tight the night tragedy stole his family. He didn't even look at it anymore. Lightning carved the horizon, turning the prairie white for a breath, then black again. And, in that flash, Caleb saw movement. Out on the muddy road, a shape staggered forward, half shadow, half flesh. At first, he thought it was a stray cow or a drifting mule caught in the storm. But then he heard it, the uneven thud of hooves, the sharp intake of breath, the cry of an animal that wasn't just hurt, it was desperate. A horse, drenched, bleeding, dragged one leg through the mud. Its chest heaved with every step, its mane plastered to its neck like wet rope. But its eyes, Lord, its eyes locked onto him across the yard. Wide, dark, burning with something that felt almost human. Caleb gripped the porch railing, his knuckles bone white. He'd seen wounded animals before. Coyotes with traps biting their legs, deer limping from hunters' arrows, once even a bear dragging its paw bloody through the snow. But never this. This horse wasn't stumbling blindly. It was looking at him, calling him. And then, impossibly, the horse turned its head toward the barn. That barn, Caleb's throat tightened. No, he muttered, though no one could hear him. His voice was ragged, drowned by thunder. Not there, not tonight. But the horse stamped once, shaking rain from its coat, and staggered closer. Each painful step splashed mud high on its flanks. When it reached the gate, it stopped, trembling, and let out a sound that made Caleb's chest split wide, a broken whinny, half pain, half command. It wasn't asking, it was demanding. The storm battered Caleb's face, cold needles of rain sliding down his neck, but he barely felt it. His heart pounded with memories he'd buried deep. The barn, the laughter of his boy, the scream that followed when the beam fell, the silence after. He had locked the door with his own hands and swore never to open it again. But the horse refused to leave. It shifted, pointing its head again toward the barn. Its ears flicked, its eyes burned, and Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years, a pull stronger than grief. Why here? His whisper cracked against the wind. Why me? He stepped off the porch, boots sinking ankle-deep into mud. Each stride carried the weight of ghosts pressing against his back. He unlatched the gate, the iron slick and cold, and the horse moved aside just enough for him to pass. When he reached the barn doors, his hands shook. The iron handle was colder than winter steel, biting into his palm. For 15 years, that door had been the line he refused to cross. Behind him, the horse let out a soft whicker pleading, insistent, steady. Caleb swallowed hard, every muscle in his body screaming to turn back, but his hand turned the latch anyway. The door groaned open, heavy, as if it resented being disturbed. The smell hit him first: old hay, dust, rot, and something else, copper, sharp, and metallic. Lightning flared again, spilling through the cracks in the roof, and Caleb's eyes adjusted to the dark. At the far stall, crumpled in a heap of straw, lay a woman. Her hair was tangled with mud, her clothes torn, her arms wrapped tight around a leather satchel as though it were her last possession on earth. For one horrifying moment, he thought she was dead. But then he saw the faint rise and fall of her chest. Alive, barely. Caleb's boots thudded across the warped planks as he approached. Kneeling beside her, he brushed hair from her face. She was young, mid-20s maybe, her skin pale, lips cracked. Ink stains smudged her fingertips, not the hands of a farm girl, but of someone who wrote for a living. Her eyelids fluttered. For the briefest instant, her gaze met his. Brown eyes, glazed with exhaustion but burning with urgency. Her lips parted, a whisper escaping like smoke. "They're poisoning the river." Then her head lolled to the side, and she went still. The horse stepped into the barn, its wounded flank quivering. It limped closer, lowered its head, and nuzzled the woman's shoulder with a gentleness that made Caleb's chest ache. The animal's eyes met his again, and in them he saw not just loyalty, but purpose. Caleb froze. Poisoning the river? What madness was this? He glanced at the satchel clutched in her arms. Papers jutted from its corners, edges stained with water and dirt. Whatever she carried, it was the reason she had made it this far. Maybe even the reason someone wanted her gone. Caleb's breath shuddered out, the storm outside echoing in his ears. For years, he had turned away from suffering, convinced it was the only way to survive. Tonight, suffering had kicked down his door and laid itself in his barn. And for the first time in 15 years, Caleb Turner didn't walk away. He eased the satchel from the woman's slack grip, slung it over his shoulder, and with a grunt, lifted her into his arms. She was feather-light, her head falling against his chest. The horse stepped aside, as though granting him passage. Lightning flashed, throwing their shadows long across the barn walls. The farmer, the stranger, and the bleeding horse, bound together by something neither of them yet understood. Caleb laid her on an old bench near the door, grabbed the lantern from the shelf, and struck a flame. Light spilled across her face, fragile and battered. He touched her wrist, felt the faintest flutter of life. His heart clenched. "Lord help me," he whispered. "I can't turn away this time." The storm raged on, rain hammering the roof, wind rattling the walls. Inside, the barn held its breath. Caleb leaned back against the post, staring at the unconscious woman, the satchel heavy with secrets at her side, and the wounded horse standing guard like a sentinel. For years, the barn had been filled with ghosts. Tonight, it held something else, something alive, dangerous, and demanding. And when the woman stirred again, her cracked lips moved once more. "They'll kill anyone who knows." Her eyes fluttered shut, but her words lingered, hanging in the air like smoke. Caleb stared at the satchel, heart pounding. Who were they? And what hell had just ridden into his life on the back of this bleeding horse? The rain softened into a steady curtain by the time Caleb finished tending the horse's wound. His hands smelled of ointment and iron, his palms raw from pressing rags against torn flesh. The mare Autumn, as Abigail had called her, stood trembling, but alive. Every so often, her muzzle brushed against his shoulder, as if to remind him she had not given up. That quiet, unyielding gesture unsettled him more than any storm. Caleb rose stiffly, his knees groaning as if they resented being called back into service after so many years of solitude. The lantern swung in his grip, casting long shadows across the barn. His gaze drifted again to the young woman lying on the bench. Abigail Ross, reporter, fugitive, trouble incarnate. And yet, her face in sleep looked less like a fighter and more like a child, mud-streaked, lips cracked, hair plastered to her brow. Her fingers clung to that battered satchel as though it held her very heartbeat. Each rise and fall of her chest seemed fragile, temporary, as though the storm outside might sweep her away at any moment. Caleb knelt again, checking her pulse. Still there. Weak, but steady. He dipped a rag in cool rainwater and wiped the grime from her forehead. For years, he had kept his hands busy only with soil and wood, but tonight they remembered something else. Care. He hated the memory of it, hated the way it cracked open doors he had sworn to keep locked. Her lashes trembled. She stirred, eyes fluttering open. For a moment she stared at him blankly. Then recognition flickered, followed by urgency. "The satchel," she whispered, voice raw. "Don't let them take it." "They?" Caleb asked, his voice low but steady. Her throat worked as she swallowed. "The company. Men hired to silence anyone who questions them. They poisoned the river, dumped chemicals from the mines. I followed, collected samples, spoke to families. It's all in here." She patted the satchel weakly. "Proof." Caleb frowned. He had heard rumors, dismissed them as gossip. But now, hearing her speak with fevered conviction, he remembered the metallic taste in his well water last summer. The neighbor's boy who had coughed for weeks. Cattle that died suddenly, their bodies swelling in the Sunday. He had turned his eyes away then, too busy burying his own ghosts. "Why bring it here?" he muttered, half to himself. Abigail's cracked lips pulled into something almost like a smile. "I didn't bring it here. Autumn did. She carried me through the storm, straight to your door." Caleb's eyes shifted to the mare. The animal lifted her head, ears flicking, as though she understood every word. He shook his head slowly. "Hell of a messenger." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady drip of rain through the rafters. Caleb wanted to walk out, to let the night swallow this madness whole, but something in Abigail's gaze held him. Her eyes burned with the same desperate fire his wife had once carried when fever stole her breath, eyes that begged him not to turn away. "Why me?" he whispered, more to the dark than to her. Abigail's voice cracked but carried. "Because you were the one who opened the door." Caleb clenched his jaw. He had spent 15 years turning away from doors. Tonight, fate had kicked one wide open. He busied himself with chores he hadn't done in years, boiling what water he could salvage, binding cloth around Abigail's ribs, cutting straw fresh for Autumn to bed down on. The task steadied him, though each one felt like a step deeper into a life he no longer recognized. At one point, Abigail stirred again, her hand brushing his arm. "If I don't make it, promise me you'll deliver the satchel." Caleb froze. He wanted to lie, to tell her she'd see it through herself, but her eyes, clear, insistent, stripped him of words. Finally, he nodded once. "Rest. You're not dying on my watch." Her lips curved faintly. "That's what they all say." She slipped back into sleep. Caleb sat back, pressing his palms against his thighs. His revolver hung from the post nearby, untouched for years. He stared at it, the metal dulled, but still heavy with memory. Once, that gun had been his trade. Once, his badge had meant something. Now both were relics of a man who no longer existed, or so he had convinced himself. But, as he sat in the flickering lantern light, the storm easing beyond the barn walls, he felt something shifting inside. The ghosts he had lived with, the wife he couldn't save, the sun crushed beneath these same beams, did not retreat. But for the first time, they seemed to move aside, making room for something new. A purpose, fragile but undeniable. The mare stirred, stamping her hoof. Caleb's head snapped up. He listened. Through the hush of rain came another sound, distant at first, then unmistakable. The crunch of hooves on wet earth. Slow, deliberate. Caleb crossed to a gap in the barn wall and peered through. Shapes moved along the ridge beyond his fields. 3 riders, maybe 4. Too neat in their formation, too polished in their coats to be neighbors. Even at a distance, their posture reeked of menace. His stomach tightened. He hadn't seen riders like that since before he swore off the world. Behind him, Abigail stirred again. Her voice, barely audible, rasped through the dark. "They found me." The mare lifted her head, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. Caleb reached for his revolver, his fingers curled around the grip. The weight was familiar, unwelcome, yet steadying. He had told himself he would never use it again, never step back into that life. But tonight, the choice was no longer his. The riders paused on the ridge, silhouettes black against the dim sky. One lifted a torch, another scanned the valley. Their horses shifted restlessly, snorting plumes of steam into the cooling air. Caleb's heart pounded. If they rode down now, if they pushed through his gate, the barn would be a trap. He glanced at Abigail, pale against the bench, clutching her satchel even in sleep. At Autumn, standing scarred but unbroken. The storm had passed, but something worse was coming. Caleb whispered to himself, voice raw in the silence. "Lord, what door have I opened?" The torch on the ridge flared brighter. Then, with a deliberate slowness that chilled him to the bone, one of the riders turned his horse toward the valley. Were they coming for him or circling to burn him out? The torchlight on the ridge burned like a watchful eye. Caleb stayed by the gap in the barn wall, body rigid, revolver heavy in his hand. The 3 riders didn't rush. They sat their saddles with the patience of men who knew fear could be as useful as fire. One lowered his hand, signaling something to the others. They split apart, 2 circling left, 1 holding back, torch lifted high. Caleb. The voice was a rasp, fragile but clear. He turned. Abigail had pushed herself up on the bench, pale and trembling, but her eyes blazed with awareness. She clutched the satchel against her chest. "They won't come fast. They like to watch first, to scare, to see if you'll run." Caleb's stomach tightened. "You've seen them before?" She nodded weakly. "Too many times. Families in Kansas, Nebraska, they circle the farm first. Then they set fire." A chill ran through him, colder than the storm outside. Fire, in this barn, with her, with Autumn, with his ghosts. He forced himself to breathe. Not tonight. Autumn pawed the straw, her ears pinned back, nostrils flaring at every faint crunch of hooves outside. The mare remembered, too, the torch, the gunshot, the men who had tried to end both their lives. Caleb crossed the barn, lifted the revolver from its nail on the post. His thumb brushed the hammer, and memory surged back. The recoil, the smell of powder, the sound of men crying out in the dark. He had buried that life with his wife and son. But now, with 3 riders circling his land, the past was clawing out of the ground. He turned to Abigail. "Stay low. Don't move until I tell you. Her lips parted, as if to protest, but something in his voice silenced her. She slid down the bench, pulling the satchel tight to her chest, eyes never leaving him. Caleb eased the barn door open, just enough to slip out. Rain had thinned to a mist, silver under the waning moon. His boots sank into mud as he stepped into the yard. He closed the door softly behind him, leaving Abigail and Autumn inside. The torch bobbed on the ridge, joined now by another faint glow, 2 torches, not one. The riders were spreading out, testing the edges of his land. Caleb walked to the porch, revolver hidden by his coat, his face grim. "Evening," he called, his voice carrying across the wet field. It sounded foreign to his own ears, rough with disuse. "You boys out late for a ride?" The nearest rider pulled up short. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the shine of his boots, the neat cut of his coat. Not ranch hands, not neighbors, hired men. "Evening," the man answered, his tone oily. "We're just looking for a runaway. Girl. Dark hair. Carrying something doesn't belong to her." He leaned forward in his saddle. "Maybe you've seen her?" Caleb kept his face unreadable. "Only thing I've seen tonight is a storm." The man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Storm blows strange things onto people's land. Sometimes it's easier to hand them over before they cause trouble. Caleb's grip tightened on the revolver. His silence stretched until the rider's smile faded. Finally, Caleb said, "This land doesn't welcome strangers. You'd best ride on." The man tilted his head, studying him. "Funny thing, folks say you keep to yourself, that you're done fighting other people's battles." His eyes gleamed. "That true?" The words cut sharper than Caleb expected. They reached into old wounds. He forced his jaw to stay firm. "True enough," he said, "which is why I don't take kindly to battles being brought to my door." The rider's smirk returned. "Then you won't mind us taking a look around." He started forward, torch flaring brighter against the damp. Caleb stepped off the porch, revolver drawn now, steady despite the pounding of his heart. "You set foot past that fence," Caleb growled, "and you'll regret it." The riders reined in. For a moment, silence hung thick. Only the rain whispered, falling into puddles that reflected the flickering torches. The man laughed, but it rang hollow this time. "We'll be back, farmer. You can't hide her forever." He wheeled his horse, the others following. Their torches bobbed as they rode off the ridge, swallowed by the night. Caleb stood in the mud long after they disappeared. His arm trembled as he lowered the revolver. He hadn't fired a shot, but the weight of what he almost did pressed hard on his chest. He returned to the barn. Abigail's eyes searched his face the moment he entered. "They'll come back," she said, her voice low, certain. "I know. They'll bring more." "I know," Caleb repeated. Autumn stepped toward him, nudging his shoulder with her muzzle. Her body trembled, but her eyes held that same fierce fire he had seen when she first staggered into his yard. Caleb let out a slow breath, pressing his hand against her warm neck. For years, he had hidden from the world, locked behind silence and grief. Tonight, the world had found him anyway, and for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't sure he wanted to run. He settled Abigail back against the bench, tucking a blanket over her trembling body. She whispered something as her eyes drifted shut again. "What did you say?" he asked, leaning closer. Her lips barely moved. "Don't turn away from suffering. That's the only sin." The words struck him like a bell. His wife's voice echoed in memory, "Don't turn away, Caleb." He clenched his jaw until it hurt. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Caleb sat against the stall, revolver across his lap, lantern turned low. Outside, the storm broke apart into a thin mist, but the unease remained. Each creak of wood, each cry of a night bird felt like a warning. By dawn, Abigail was breathing easier, though her face stayed pale. Autumn dozed lightly, her body curled protectively near the bench. Caleb's eyes burned from lack of sleep. He pushed himself up and stepped outside. The sky was a wash of pale gray, the fields glittering with dew. For a moment, the world seemed ordinary again, but then he saw it black in streaks on the far wall of the barn. Charred wood. Someone had tried to light it during the night. He rushed forward, running his hand over the scorched boards. The fire hadn't taken, the storm had smothered it, but the message was clear. They hadn't left. They were circling, testing, waiting. Caleb's stomach knotted. He wasn't just protecting his farm anymore. He was standing at the edge of something larger, darker. Abigail's satchel wasn't just trouble, it was a spark that men would kill to extinguish. He heard movement behind him. Abigail, clutching the satchel, had stepped into the doorway, her eyes hard, despite her weakness. "They won't stop," she said. "Not until one of us is dead." Caleb stared at the scorch marks, then at her. The morning light caught the bad-shaped scar he still carried in memory, the one he swore he'd buried. His hand closed tighter around the revolver. The question pressed heavier than the clouds above. Would he stand and fight this time, or turn away again? The blackened wood still smoked faintly when Caleb pulled his hand back from the barn wall. He stared at the scorch marks, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. They had tried to burn him out while he kept watch inside. If not for the storm's rain, everything Abigail, Autumn, his ghosts would have gone up in flames. Behind him, Abigail leaned weakly against the doorframe, satchel strapped across her chest. Her hair was tangled, her face pale, but her eyes carried that same fierce conviction. "They'll try again," she whispered. Caleb turned, his face grim. "And next time, the rain won't be there to stop them." Autumn shifted behind Abigail, ears twitching, head lowering until her muzzle brushed the woman's shoulder. Abigail's hand rose automatically to stroke the mare's neck, and for a moment Caleb felt a pang of something he hadn't allowed in years: envy. That bond, that trust, that certainty. He'd lost it with his family long ago, buried under soil and silence. He looked away, scanning the open prairie beyond his fields. The horizon stretched endless and empty, but he knew better. They weren't gone, they were circling, waiting. He couldn't fight them alone. Caleb's thoughts drifted to a face he hadn't seen in years: Harold Green, the town's doctor. Harold was the only man who still called on him from time to time, dropping by with a jar of salve or a game of chess no one ever finished. If there was anyone he could trust to keep a secret, it was Harold. He turned back to Abigail. "I need to fetch help." Her brow furrowed. "You'd risk leaving us here?" Caleb hesitated, torn. "I don't see another choice. I can't tend to you, protect the horse, and hold off armed men all by myself." Abigail's grip tightened on the satchel. "If they come while you're gone, they won't," he cut her off, though the certainty in his voice was paper thin. "Autumn will hear them first, and Doc Green lives close. I'll be back before they make another move." Autumn let out a low whicker, stamping once as though agreeing to the burden Caleb had laid on her. Abigail looked into the horse's eyes, then nodded reluctantly. "Go," she whispered, "but don't take long." Caleb saddled his gelding, leather creaking with disuse, and rode hard across the muddy track toward town. The prairie stretched wide and still damp from the night's storm. His heart pounded not from the ride, but from the weight of what he carried: Abigail's truth, Autumn's wound, and the question gnawing at him. Could one broken man stand against men backed by money, guns, and the arrogance of power? Harold Green opened his door before Caleb knocked. The old doctor's weathered face broke into lines of surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," Harold said softly. "Didn't expect to see you riding up, not after all these years." Caleb dismounted, mud splattering his boots. "Need your hands, Doc. Bad." Harold studied him a moment, then grabbed his black bag from the hook. "Lead the way." Back at the barn, Harold moved with the calm of a man who had patched more wounds than he could count. He checked Abigail first, peeling back Caleb's clumsy bandages. "You did what you could," Harold murmured, rewrapping her ribs with practiced efficiency. "She'll live, if she rests." Abigail's eyes flicked open briefly. "Doc Green? That's me," he smiled faintly. "Now hush. Talking wastes breath you don't have." Then Harold turned to Autumn. The mare's flank trembled as he knelt beside her. His hands worked quickly, stitching where Caleb's rags had failed. Autumn stood rigid, but still, her trust unwavering. Harold patted her neck when he finished. "This one's tougher than most men I know," he said. Caleb stood back, watching them both, Abigail breathing easier under Harold's care, Autumn steadier now. For the first time in 15 years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: relief shared with another man. But peace was a luxury they couldn't afford. That afternoon, as the gray light stretched long across the valley, the sound of hooves reached them again. Caleb stiffened. Harold's head snapped up. Abigail clutched the satchel tight against her chest. Autumn raised her head, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. Caleb stepped to the barn wall, peering through a gap. 3 riders, no torches this time, but rifles slung casual across their saddles. They weren't probing now. They were hunting. He returned to the others, his voice low but hard. "They're here." Harold checked the chamber of his old rifle, the one he kept from his army days. His eyes met Caleb's. "Looks like you dragged me into something real, old friend." "You can still walk away," Caleb said. Harold shook his head. "Not when children are drinking poison, not when men like that ride free." Caleb's chest tightened. It wasn't just him anymore. The circle was widening. Abigail, Autumn, Harold. Each of them had something to lose, and each of them had chosen to stay. The riders didn't come close this time. They circled at a distance, their eyes sweeping the farm like wolves measuring prey. Then, slowly, they rode back up the ridge, disappearing into the haze. Abigail's whisper broke the silence. "They're waiting for more." Caleb didn't answer. He didn't have to. He felt it too. The storm that had carried Abigail and Autumn to his door was nothing compared to the storm that was gathering now. That night, Caleb sat at the old workbench, lantern glowing faintly beside him. In his hands lay a box he hadn't opened in years. The hinges squealed when he lifted the lid. Inside lay his revolver belt, a marshal's badge dulled with time, and letters he had sworn never to read again. He brushed his thumb over the badge. He had once worn it with pride, swearing to protect the innocent. Then came loss, silence, retreat. He had turned away from suffering, believing it would save him. But Abigail's words echoed in his head. "Don't turn away. That's the only sin." His chest tightened as he pinned the badge beneath his coat. The weight was heavier than he remembered. Morning came brittle and sharp, the kind of day when every sound carried clear across the plains. Caleb stood outside the barn, revolver at his side, badge pressing against his chest like a second heart. Abigail leaned on the doorway, satchel strapped close. Harold checked Autumn's bandages one last time. They all froze when dust rose on the horizon. Not 3 riders this time, not 4. At least a dozen. Their coats glinted, their rifles caught the morning Sunday. They rode with the confidence of men who believed no one could stop them. Abigail's voice trembled. "They've brought the company." Caleb's eyes narrowed, jaw tight. The time for hiding was over. The riders slowed, forming a wide line across the ridge. Then, their leader, a man in a dark coat, boots polished like a banker's, raised his hand. "Mr. Turner." His voice carried like a blade. "We've heard you're harboring stolen property. Hand it over, and maybe we'll forget you were ever involved." Caleb's hand brushed the badge under his coat. He stepped forward, revolver steady, voice hard. "You poisoned our river. That makes it my fight." The leader's smile faltered. He lowered his hand. The riders fanned out, rifles shifting. The yard fell silent, the air heavy. The next moment poised like a held breath. And Caleb wondered, not for the first time, was this the day the past he'd buried finally demanded its price? The riders on the ridge didn't blink when Caleb refused. They sat tall, rifles easy in their hands, as if a dozen armed men were as ordinary as a Sunday stroll. The leader's smile never reached his eyes. "Think carefully, Mr. Turner," he called. "You've got a sick horse, a wounded woman, and one old doctor with shaky hands. Hand over the satchel. The company will forget your name." Caleb felt the badge under his coat press into his chest like a hot coin. He didn't raise his gun. Not yet. "You'll have to ride through me." A murmur ran down the line of riders. The leader gave a slow nod, as if he'd just confirmed something he already believed. "We'll be seeing you." He pulled his horse around. The rest followed, fanning back to the ridge. No dust, no rush, just a promise that they'd return when it suited them. Abigail's fingers dug into the strap of the satchel. They won't hit an open farm at noon. They like cover and panic. Doc Harold kept his face composed, but Caleb saw the way the old man's jaw tightened. "They'll come when they think our hands are full. And when they can scare the whole town at once," Abigail added, grim. Caleb looked past them to the long stretch of prairie, the empty mile between his gate and the first houses of Cedar Ridge. You could hear a lie travel that distance quicker than a truth on a good day. Today, a lie might ride in with a badge pinned to it. "We go to town," he said. "We tell the sheriff. We don't hide this in a barn." Abigail swallowed. "If he's with them, then I want to see it in his eyes," Caleb said. They saddled up. Autumn whickered low, shifting her weight on her stitched flank. Doc cupped her jaw, murmuring, "Easy, girl, you've already done enough." But Autumn stepped forward anyway, pressing her muzzle into Abigail's shoulder. It felt like a blessing and a question both. They rode the 2 miles into Cedar Ridge at a careful pace, keeping Autumn sheltered between Caleb and Doc. The town wore the same tired face it always had, false fronts, a line of stoops, the church spire poking up like a finger pointing nowhere in particular. On good days, the place smelled of coffee and sawdust. Today it smelled like people who pretended not to watch. Sheriff Jacob Collins stood outside his office, hat low, arms folded. When he saw Caleb, surprise cut across his face, then smoothed out into something unreadable. "Turner," he said. "Doc. Miss." His eyes dipped to the satchel, then flicked back up. "You heard they rode out to my place," Caleb said. No greeting. Collins slid his tongue against his teeth. "People talk. Rockland's men claim they're looking for stolen company property." Abigail's voice came steady. "They're looking for proof they've been poisoning the river. This is evidence, Sheriff. Not stolen goods." She lifted the satchel an inch. A piano tinkled a few doors down and died mid-note. Somebody's curtain twitched and went still. Collins looked tired enough to be honest. There's a lot of power behind those men, miss. They've got lawyers. I put my hand in this. I have to be sure I'm not dragging this town under a wheel we can't stop. Town's already under it, Caleb said. You been to the South Wells lately? Metallic taste for 3 weeks last summer. Henderson boy coughs like he's got cinders in his lungs. Thompson's lost 3 head without a mark. That wheel's been rolling a while. Across the street, Pastor Webb paused on the church steps, listening. The general store owner stood in his doorway with a broom and no sweeping to do. Collins held up a hand. I'm not blind, Caleb, and I'm not reckless. You bring me paper, I'll read it, but I won't go to war with a company on hearsay. Hearsay? Abigail's jaw tightened. She opened the satchel. Inside lay folded reports, stamped letters, and a glass specimen bottle wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it with delicate care and held it up. Even in the morning light, the water inside looked wrong, cloudy, tinged a faint yellow-gray. Sample from the Arkansas, 2 miles below Rockland's discharge channel, she said. Taken 3 nights ago. I had another bottle. Her voice thinned. They broke it when they caught me. Collins stared at the bottle a beat too long, then looked away. I need more than a bottle. Chain of custody. Names. Dates. Abigail's eyes flashed. They tried to kill me for this. How careful do you think I could be? Before Collins could answer, hoofbeats clattered at the far end of Main Street. 6 riders slid into view, not the dozen from Caleb's farm, but cut from the same cloth coats neat, boots shining. One let his horse prance a little, enjoying the sound. The leader tipped an imaginary hat. Morning, Sheriff. Gentlemen, ma'am. His eyes landed on the satchel. Rockland appreciates civic cooperation. We'll take our property and leave your town in peace. A window pane cracked somewhere. Someone had pressed too hard. Collins's hand drifted toward his holster, then stopped. He glanced at the faces in the windows, the storekeeper, the seamstress, the 2 boys pressed cheek to glass like quarter moons. He swallowed. Caleb stepped half a pace forward. Property, is it? Funny thing to call a river that feeds our children. The rider's smile flattened. Last time, Turner, we spoke politely. This time I'll be plain. Hand it over. Abigail's fingers tightened on the strap until her knuckles went white. If you take this, people die. The rider flicked his eyes at Collins. Sheriff? Silence stretched the length of the street. Even the wind seemed to step back. Collins finally spoke, voice low. I'll see the documents. In my office. Alone. Abigail stared at him. Alone is where they make things disappear. Alone is how I keep a lid on the powder keg you just kicked, Collins snapped, and some of the weariness fell away to show the steel underneath. He looked at the riders. No one takes anything in my town by threat. The leader's smile came back, thinner. Of course, Sheriff. We're law-abiding men. He didn't move an inch. Pastor Webb's bell clanged once, accidental or not, no one could tell. It sounded like a warning, or a prayer that lost its way. Caleb felt the air change the way it does before lightning strikes. He said, without looking at Collins, You know the truth, Jacob. You've known it a while. Collins stared at the bottle in Abigail's hand. He took 1 step, then another, slow as a man walking onto thin ice. He reached out. Abigail hesitated, then placed the specimen bottle in his palm. Don't lose it, she said. The leader of the riders shifted in his saddle. Careful, Sheriff. That looks fragile. Collins tucked the bottle inside his coat, behind the badge. So am I, he said. Still here. The rider's eyes cooled. We'll be back this evening. If the town has sense, this will be over. They wheeled as a unit and trotted to the far end of the street, then broke into a canter and vanished in a rattle of tack and smug silence. People exhaled, doors edged open. The storekeeper finally remembered the broom. Pastor Webb stepped off the church stoop and crossed to them. You all right, Sheriff? The pastor asked. No, Collins said, but I'm working on it. Inside the sheriff's office, the 4 of them crowded around the desk. Collins, Caleb, Abigail, Doc. The room smelled of old coffee and oiled leather. Collins spread the papers out, reading faster than Caleb expected. Names, shipping timetables. A letter that said discharge was within acceptable variance. A ledger that didn't add up unless you understood which column was for bribes. And this? Collins asked, holding a set of orders bearing an Eastern signature. Authorization to divert waste on temporary emergency basis, Abigail said. The emergency is profit. Collins rubbed his temples. If I act on this and I'm wrong. You're not, Caleb said. If I act on this and I'm right, Collins continued, they'll bring twice as many guns as you saw today. Then don't act alone, Doc said mildly, as if suggesting a different thread for a suture. Swear in deputies, call the judge, send a telegraph to Denver. Put this in daylight, where it's harder to kill. Collins's eyes flicked to the telegraph on the back table. The operator's nephew works for Rockland. They'd get it first. Abigail touched the satchel. Then I ride. I get this to Denver Post. We publish. Once it's out, they can't bury it without burying the whole state. That road's near 20 miles of open ground, Collins said. They'll cut you down before you reach the foothills. Silence pressed close. Caleb listened to his own heartbeat and hated that it sounded like fear. He looked at Autumn through the window, tied to the post outside, resting a hind leg, patient as a Sunday saint. The mare's ears twitched toward every noise, listening for trouble like she had nothing else to do. Caleb said, "We split the risk. Sheriff, you start the paperwork, whatever gives you cover. Doc, you stay with the town. Abby and I head back to the farm. We'll draw their heat there until you're ready." Abigail shook her head. "That makes your place the target." "It already is," Caleb said. "Better me than folks with nothing to do with this." Collins looked between them, jaw working. "If you go back, they won't play it circling. They'll come hard." Caleb met his eyes. "Then meet us halfway. When you hear the first shot, don't weigh it. Move." Collins stared a breath too long, then nodded once, like a man signing a debt he'd long owed. "I'll deputize a few men I trust, quietly. Pastor Webb can ring the bell when it starts. 2 long, 1 short. Folks will know." They stepped out into the noon glare. The town carried on with the delicate pretense of ordinary life. A woman measuring fabric with a strip of twine, a boy skipping a rock that smacked against a horse trough and made the gelding flick an ear in mild offense. Everything looked normal if you kept your eyes unfocused. Abigail touched Caleb's sleeve. "If I don't make it, don't," he said. "We're not doing that speech again." Her mouth twitched. "Bossy." "Stubborn," he shot back. Doc mounted up, looking older than the morning but steadier. Collins tucked the specimen bottle deeper inside his coat, as if to put his badge between it and the world. They rode back toward the farm at an easy pace to spare Autumn, cutting across a creek that ran 2 inches higher than yesterday and smelled faintly metallic even through the clean tang of snowmelt. Caleb pretended not to notice. Abigail didn't pretend. She looked away and blinked hard. By late afternoon, the sky turned the color of tin, the sort of light that flattens distance and makes you guess wrong about how far the horizon really island. Caleb and Abigail set the barn in order. Water buckets filled, lanterns trimmed, a shovel propped by the door in case flame needed smothering. Doc checked Autumn's stitches again and shook his head in amazement at the mare's refusal to favor the leg more than she absolutely had to. As twilight bled into a dull purple, the first sound came a crow call that wasn't a crow, from the north fence line. Then another, to the west. Signals. Abigail's hand went to the satchel. Autumn lifted her head, muscles coiling under skin. Caleb snapped the lantern wick down to a thin bead of fire. The yard went from gold to gray, then to a kind of watchful dark. A glow pulsed on the ridge. Not 1 torch this time, not 2. 6, then more, farther out, answering like stars that meant harm. Doc eased the barn door half closed and chambered around. "They didn't come to talk." "Good," Caleb said softly. "I'm done talking." A shout floated down the slope, too far to catch the words, close enough to hear the intent. Horses snorted. Tack jingled in the stop-and-go rhythm of men finding their places. Somewhere to the south, a fuse sizzled, brief, vicious. Abigail's eyes widened. Dynamite. The words seemed to shorten the space between where they stood and what was coming. Caleb felt the badge burn against his chest. He set his shoulders, checked the revolver, and took 1 step toward the door. In the hush, right before everything breaks, a single sound cut across the yard. Autumn's low, steady rumble, a sound that wasn't fear at all. Was it possible a horse could be telling a man, "Stay with me and we'll hold"? The fuse hissed again, closer this time, and a small orange bead of fire crept through the grass toward the barn wall. Caleb raised his gun, breath held. Would the first blast take the door or the man behind it? The fuse hissed like a rattlesnake slithering through the grass. Caleb threw himself forward, boots slapping mud, and stomped hard on the ember just before it touched the dynamite stick. Smoke curled around his ankle, acrid and sharp. He ground his heel until the hiss choked out and the spark died. Then the night erupted. A rifle cracked from the ridge. Splinters burst from the barn wall, inches from Caleb's head. He ducked low, rolling in the mud, revolver in hand. Another shot rang, then another, each report echoing off the open prairie. Inside the barn, Abigail screamed his name. Doc Harold yanked her to the ground, shielding her with his wiry frame. Autumn reared, slamming her hooves against the stallboards, eyes wide, teeth bared in a sound that was more fury than fear. Caleb burst back inside, slamming the door with his shoulder, His chest heaved, shirt plastered to his skin with rain and sweat. "Dynamite," Abigail panted, clutching the satchel. "They mean to blow us out." "No," Caleb growled, wiping mud from his revolver grip. "They mean to burn this place into memory." Another explosion roared from the west. Light seared through the gaps in the barn slats, followed by a wave of heat and flying dirt. The roof beams groaned, dust raining down. Abigail coughed. Harold dragged her closer, and Autumn screamed again, pulling against her rope until the fibers creaked. Caleb steadied his breath, forcing the ghosts back down. "They're not playing at fear anymore. They've come to finish it." Abigail lifted her head. Her face was pale, her lips split, but her eyes burned with the stubborn fire that had carried her this far. "Then don't let them bury us here. Make them remember tonight. Make it cost them." Her words hit Caleb like a hammer. For 15 years, he had lived with the weight of silence, believing that retreat was survival. But survival without purpose was just another kind of grave. Tonight demanded more. He checked his revolver, 3 rounds left. He loaded 2 more from his belt, each bullet sliding home with a sound that felt final. He lifted his head toward the rafters. "Harold, keep her breathing. Abigail, stay low. If they get close, don't hesitate." Then he swung the barn door wide and stepped into the storm of gunfire. The ridge glowed with torches. Riders fanned out like wolves, rifles flashing in jagged lines. The air sang with bullets, mud spattering, boards shattering, the acrid sting of powder filling his lungs. Caleb dropped to one knee, aimed, and fired. A rider spun from his saddle, torch falling to hiss in the wet earth. "Turner!" The company man's voice rang cold and sharp over the chaos. "You can't win. Hand her over, and we'll leave your grave unmarked." Caleb fired again, answering with lead instead of words. The man nearest the torchbearer screamed, toppling from his horse. From inside the barn came the crack of Harold's rifle. One shot, then another steady, measured. Despite his shaking hands, the old doctor shot true. A rider jerked, clutching his side, his mount bolting into the dark. Autumn burst free. Her rope snapped under her weight as she tore through the doorway, white against the dark, mane flying. She charged straight at the torch line. Hooves cracked against a chest with the sound of splintering wood. A man screamed, crumpling under her fury. Another rider dropped his torch, startled by the blaze of rage bearing down on him. Gunfire chased her, sparks flying from her flank, but Autumn wheeled away, plunging back toward the barn. She slid in behind Caleb, nostrils flaring, chest heaving. Caleb pressed a hand against her trembling neck, fury and gratitude colliding in his chest. Then, like salvation, the sound rang through the night. The church bell, 2 long tolls, 1 short. Cedar Ridge had heard. A volley cracked from the east road. Sheriff Collins rode hard at the head of 3 men, rifles leveled. Their shots ripped through the company's line, scattering horses, breaking the neat precision of their formation. Collins shouted, his voice thunder over the storm. "Hold the line! Don't let 'em circle!" The tide shifted. Riders reeled, horses bucked, torches scattered in the mud. Caleb surged forward, Autumn at his side, revolver barking in rhythm with Harold's steady rifle and Collins's booming Winchester. Abigail appeared at the barn doorway, pale and trembling but holding a rifle in her own hands. She braced herself, fired, and though the recoil nearly toppled her, her bullet found its mark. A rider spun backward, rifle clattering useless into the dirt. The company broke. Horses bolted, men shouted, the torches fell like dying stars into the mud. Within minutes, the ridge was empty again. The night fell silent, broken only by the ringing in Caleb's ears and the ragged breath of the living. Collins dismounted, boots squelching in the mud. His face was lined, weary, but alive with something Caleb hadn't seen in years resolve. "That was half their force," he said grimly. "Maybe more, but they'll be back. Next time, they'll bring everything." Abigail clutched the satchel tighter, her voice hoarse but unyielding. "Then, we don't wait for next time. We take this to Denver. We publish it. Once the truth's out, they can't bury it." Harold wiped his brow, rifle still in his hands. "She's right. The longer we sit here, the more blood they'll spill to keep it quiet." Caleb looked at his farm fences shattered, earth scarred, barn pocked with bullet holes. His home was no longer sanctuary, it was battleground. But he wasn't just a farmer anymore. He pressed a hand to the badge beneath his coat, feeling its weight steady him. He exhaled slowly. "Then we ride before dawn. If we wait, they'll bring dynamite enough to level the whole town." Collins nodded. "I'll deputize men I trust." Quietly. "Pastor Webb can ring the bell when it starts 2 long, 1 short. Folks will know to rally." Abigail's lips curved faintly, though her body trembled with exhaustion. "And I'll carry this." She patted the satchel. "Even if it kills me." Caleb met her gaze, steady and unflinching. Not on my watch. The words settled heavy in the barn. For the first time in years, he believed them himself. But as dawn's first gray light touched the horizon, Caleb's relief died in his throat. Far beyond the ridge, across the open prairie, fresh dust rose against the sky. Another column of riders. Not half a dozen, not a dozen, twice that, maybe more. He froze, blood turning to stone. Abigail followed his gaze. Her face went pale, her hand tightening on the satchel until her knuckles showed white. Collins cursed under his breath. Harold murmured a prayer that sounded too short to carry much hope. Caleb whispered, almost to himself, "Lord, how many more are coming?" The new line of riders crested the far ridge, sunlight glinting off rifles and polished coats, and the question slammed into him harder than any bullet. Could Cedar Ridge stand against the full weight of Rockland's war, or had they already lost, before the real fight even began? Dust climbed into the pale sky, thick and rolling, rising from the hooves of dozens of riders. Caleb stood in the barnyard, fists clenched at his sides, revolver heavy on his hip. Abigail leaned against the doorway, face pale but eyes locked on the horizon. Doc Harold muttered a prayer under his breath. Sheriff Collins cursed softly, his hat brim low over his grim eyes. "They're bringing the company's full weight," Collins said, "and not just guns. Men like that, they bring fear." Caleb's jaw set. "Then we answer with something stronger." Autumn pawed the ground, tossing her head, the early light glinting off her scarred flank. She moved closer to Abigail, pressing her muzzle against the woman's shoulder, as if to anchor her against what was coming. Abigail's hand tightened on the satchel strap. They rode into town slowly, deliberately. No gallop, no panic. Caleb wanted the town to see them arrive upright, not broken. Collins rode at his side, Doc Harold steady behind. Abigail sat stiff in the saddle, her body fragile but her posture defiant. Autumn followed, limping but proud, her white coat catching every eye. Cedar Ridge stirred as they passed. Curtains twitched. Doors opened an inch, then wider. People stepped onto porches, the storekeeper with his broom, Pastor Webb with his collar askew, mothers clutching children, men with faces drawn tight by years of looking away. Caleb raised his voice, hard and steady. "They're coming for us. Not just me, not just her, for this whole town. Poison in our wells, sickness in our children. They think we'll bow because we've been bowed before." The townsfolk listened, some wide-eyed, some trembling, but no one turned away. Abigail drew a breath and lifted the satchel high. "This is proof. Signed orders, ledgers, samples. They've been killing us in slow motion. If they silence me, they silence all of you." Her voice cracked but carried. Silence followed, thick as dust. Then Pastor Webb stepped forward, voice firm. "If we stand now, the bell will toll for freedom. If we hide, it tolls for our graves." Collins's hand dropped to his holster. "Choose quick. They'll be here by sundown." By noon, the square was full. Men who hadn't touched rifles since the war pulled them from under beds. Women filled water buckets, stacked sandbags, and dragged wagons across alleys. Pastor Webb rang the bell, not in alarm, but in rhythm, slow, steady, a call to gather. Caleb moved among them, checking posts, showing how to notch rifles into window frames, how to lay buckets along rooftops against fire. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a marshal again, his voice carrying authority he hadn't worn in 15 years. Abigail sat near the well, papers spread before her. Children peeked over her shoulder as she pointed to signatures, letters, maps. "Remember these names," she told them. "Not mine, theirs, so you'll know who stole from you." The children nodded, wide-eyed, memorizing words they didn't fully understand but would never forget. When the dust cloud reached the edge of town, hearts clenched. 50 riders, maybe more, their coats clean, their rifles gleaming. At their center rode the company man. Dark coat, polished boots, smile as sharp as broken glass. He pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of Main Street. The silence was so deep you could hear the creak of leather, the snort of horses, the click of spurs. "Well," he drawled, "looks like the whole town crawled out to die together." Collins stepped forward, badge glinting. "This is Cedar Ridge. We don't hand neighbors over to company thugs." The man's smile cooled. "Neighbors? That woman carries stolen property. You protect her. You sign your own death warrants." Abigail pushed herself upright, satchel across her chest. Her voice rang clear. "The only stolen thing here is our water, our children's health, our land, and we're taking it back." The crowd stirred, a murmur rose, anger and courage mixing. The company man's eyes narrowed. He raised a hand. 50 rifles lifted in unison, barrels aimed down the street. Caleb stepped forward. revolver steady in his hand, badge under his coat like a second heart. "You fire on this town, you start a war you won't finish." The man's smile returned, thin and cruel. "We brought enough to finish it twice." The standoff stretched, breath held by every soul. Then Collins gave a signal. Rifles rose from windows, barrels poking from wagons, rooftops, door frames. Cedar Ridge bristled with steel it hadn't shown in decades. "You think we've been blind?" Collins shouted. "We've been waiting, and we've got enough to send half your men home in pine boxes." The company line shifted, horses stamped, nervous under the weight of tension. The man studied the street, the rifles, the faces, ordinary people, but eyes sharp with something that couldn't be bought: resolve. He lowered his hand. His men hesitated, confused. "We'll be back," he said finally, his voice cutting through the dust. "And next time, we won't come with rifles alone." He wheeled his horse, the line following, dust rising again as they pulled away from the square. Cedar Ridge exhaled as one. Mothers hugged children. Men lowered rifles. The bell rang once, long and heavy, not in fear, but in warning. It was not over. Caleb holstered his revolver slowly, scanning the retreating dust. His heart didn't ease. He knew the man was right. Rifles weren't the end. Companies like Rockland had deeper weapons. That night, as townsfolk fortified the square, Abigail sat beside Autumn, stroking her neck. Caleb joined her, lowering himself onto the trough. "They stood," Abigail whispered. "For once, they stood." Caleb nodded. "But standing's only the start." The sound came faint, distant at first, then unmistakable. A mechanical rattle, alien against the prairie silence. Not hooves, not rifles, something heavier, deadlier. Collins emerged from his office, face pale. "Dear God," he muttered. "They brought a Gatling." The noise grew louder, steady as grinding teeth. Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. He whispered to Abigail, almost to himself, "Can we hold against that?" The rattle answered before she could. The first stuttering clatter echoed across the plains like the grinding of metal teeth. Caleb Turner stiffened where he stood in the town square, every nerve sparking. He hadn't heard that sound since the war. "Gatling," Sheriff Collins said, his voice low but heavy enough to chill the crowd. "They're bringing one of those damned crank-fed cannons." Mothers pulled children closer. Men shifted nervously on porches, rifles suddenly feeling like toys. Abigail's knuckles whitened around the satchel strap. Caleb stepped forward, planting himself in the center of the square. "Listen to me," his voice carried over the rising rattle. "That gun is meant to break your spirit before it breaks your bones, but it only fires where it's pointed, and we've got cover. We've got grit. We're not giving this town up." The people of Cedar Ridge stirred, looking not at the horizon, but at one another. Pastor Webb rang the bell again, not fast, not frantic, but steady boom, boom like a heartbeat. Then the riders came. Dust swirled as the company force wheeled into view, wagon creaking, and there it was, the Gatling gun mounted high, its barrels already glinting in the last of the Sunday. The dark-coated man from before raised his arm, smiling like he already saw the square painted in blood. "Ready," he barked. The barrels spun. "Down!" Caleb shouted. Townsfolk dove behind wagons, barrels, sandbags. The gun roared, a monstrous stutter tearing through the square. Wood splintered, windows shattered, dust and smoke filled the air. Screams rang out, but no one broke. Caleb rolled behind the trough, heart hammering. He'd seen men shredded by less, but Cedar Ridge wasn't running. "Flank it," he yelled to Collins. The sheriff nodded, signaling men through alleys. Shots cracked from rooftops. One rider tumbled from his saddle. Another fell against the wagon. The Gatling wavered, its aim jerking. Then Autumn charged. The white mare burst from the stable yard like a streak of lightning. Her flank was still scarred, her body battered, but her cry cut through the roar of the gun. She bolted across the square, drawing fire with reckless courage. Bullets churned dust at her hooves, but she dodged, veered, forced the gunners to track her instead of the townsfolk. "God Almighty," Doc Harold whispered, staring. Abigail screamed, half in fear, half in awe. Caleb seized the moment. He sprinted from cover, revolver raised. Collins's men fired in rhythm, one after another, forcing the riders to duck. The flankers reached the wagon, tossing lantern oil onto its wheels. A single shot set it ablaze. Flames licked up the sides, horses panicked. The gun faltered. "Now!" Caleb bellowed. He charged with Collins, their shots finding marks. 2 riders dropped, a third fled. The wagon lurched as fire consumed its frame. The gun's barrels slowed, coughed, then ground to silence. The square filled with smoke and firelight, but Cedar Ridge was still standing. Men rose from cover. Women dragged the wounded to safety. Children peeked from doorways, wide-eyed but unbroken. Autumn circled back, sides heaving, her white coat streaked with mud and blood, but her head high, ears forward. She had done it, turned a killing machine into a distraction long enough for human courage to strike. The company leader sat rigid on his black horse, his smile gone. He looked at the flames devouring his weapon, at his men scattering under the town's fire, at the white mare standing like a sentinel in the square. His sneer curled, but it was thinner now, a mask slipping. "This isn't over," he spat. "You've bought yourselves a day, maybe two, but you can't fight money. You can't fight the men behind me. This town will choke on its own defiance." Caleb leveled his revolver, steady as stone. "Then you tell your masters Cedar Ridge isn't for sale. Not its water, not its land, not its people." The man's eyes flashed hate. He yanked his reins, turned his horse, and vanished into the smoke with what was left of his force. The sound of retreating hooves faded into the dark. Silence held, broken only by the crackle of the burning wagon. Slowly, townsfolk emerged from hiding. Relief swept the square like a wave. Cheers rose, ragged but real. Abigail stumbled forward, clutching the satchel to her chest. Tears streaked her dirt-stained cheeks. "They'll be back," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "With lawyers, with more guns, with everything they've got." Caleb rested a hand on her shoulder, then looked around at the gathered faces, at Autumn standing steady beside them. "Then we'll be ready." The townsfolk nodded, some in grim silence, others with tired but fierce smiles. For the first time in years, Cedar Ridge felt like more than a dot on a map. It felt alive. But as the fire burned lower, Collins crouched near the wrecked Gatling, his brow furrowed. He pulled a charred metal plate free, its surface stamped with a seal. Not the company's name, something else. He held it up to the lamplight. The words glinted faintly. United Western Syndicate, Federal Contract. His voice dropped, carrying only to Caleb and Abigail. This wasn't just Rockland. They had government contracts backing them. Abigail's breath caught. If that's true, this fight's bigger than Cedar Ridge. Caleb stared at the plate, then at the smoke curling toward the stars. Bigger forces, deeper corruption. What they faced tonight might only have been the first wave. Behind him, Autumn nickered softly, her gaze steady, unafraid. Caleb whispered, half to himself, half to the mare. "How far does this go?" The night offered no answer, only the echo of the Gatling's rattle, fading into memory, and the chilling promise that the war for their river had only begun. This story carries a value far deeper than gunfights, poisoned rivers, or storms over the prairie. At its core, it is about the human spirit's refusal to bow when confronted with loss, grief, and injustice. Caleb Turner's journey from a broken farmer, haunted by the ghosts of his past, to a man who chooses to stand again, reminds us that healing often comes not by turning away from suffering, but by stepping into it with courage. For Abigail, it is a lesson in the power of truth, that even when bruised, hunted, and silenced, a single voice carrying evidence of injustice can awaken an entire community. And Autumn, the wounded horse who led Caleb back to his locked barn, becomes more than an animal. She is a living symbol of loyalty, sacrifice, and the silent strength that calls people back to their humanity. In life, many of us face storms we never chose, doors we swore never to open, and battles that feel larger than ourselves. This story teaches that even in our isolation, even when grief convinces us we are finished, there is always a moment where courage can be reborn. It shows that communities, when united, can resist forces that seem unstoppable. Most importantly, it reminds us that legacy is not built on wealth or titles, but on standing for something larger than our own survival. The value here is timeless. Never underestimate the ripple of one act of bravery, one voice of truth, one bond of loyalty. Together, they can turn fear into fire, despair into resolve, and silence into a song that echoes for generations. This is the heart of resilience, and it is the gift the story leaves behind.